Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable and panel discussion entitled, "Is Canada Shaping a New Model for Managing the Refugee Crisis? Reflections from Government, Community, and Civil Society in Canada, alongside the EU perspective." My name is Thorlakson. I'm the director of the European Union Centre of Excellence here at the University of Alberta, and together with the Curie Institute for Advanced Study and the Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies, I would like to welcome you here today. Before going any further, it's my pleasure to welcome Associate Dean Stuart Landon to offer some remarks on behalf of the Faculty of Arts.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. I would like to thank our panelists for taking the time to be here. I'd particularly like to thank the Edmonton Mennonite Center for Newcomers for being a partner in hosting today's roundtable. Movements of people fleeing conflict or persecution have been fixtures in the news for my entire life, and I expect almost everyone's life who is here. And yet the current crisis, stimulated by the wars in Syria and elsewhere, appears to be unprecedented in my lifetime. The sheer number of people on the move and requiring support and resettlement, I find very difficult to comprehend, as is the number of people who are stranded in refugee camps in the Middle East. This crisis has exposed us as a society to, I think, some very difficult questions, such as how many refugees should we accept? How many refugees can we accept? How should we choose who to accept? How should we support refugees once they arrive in Canada? And who should pay for that support? Should we care about integrating refugees into Canadian society? And how can this best be done? And what are the consequences when integration fails? And these are just questions that I've been thinking about for the last couple months as the refugee crisis has gone through the news and become, I think it's in front of everyone, and so everyone's thinking about these things. But I think these are really difficult, real-world questions. And it's really important that the university, through the breadth of knowledge and the perspectives of the academics who work here, the students who are here, as well as the broader community related to the university, that we play a key role in developing answers to these types of difficult questions. One starting point, I think, for doing this is this type of roundtable, where we can begin a discussion. A further contribution is made by projects such as the Migration Views project, which has been developed very quickly, I should say, by the University of Alberta's Curie Institute for Advanced Studies, the European Union Centre for Excellence, and the Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies. So it's a very interdisciplinary approach to looking at the refugee crisis. And really its purpose, and it's very easy to find if you just type in Migration Views into the web, it will come up. And its purpose is to collect scholarly and professional and personal reflections on migration and the European refugee crisis. And so far they've collected actually a large number of videos and written contributions on the refugee crisis from a broad spectrum of researchers and individuals, government officials, etc. And I think this is a really impressive example of how the university can contribute, and contribute quickly, to the discussion and search for answers on a really critical issue that faces us today. I think we need more discussion and answers to the key questions that relate to this crisis, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming and participating in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Now, as Stuart mentions, this event, it's not a one-off event. It builds from the Migration Views website, where over the past few months, we've been compiling contributions from academics across faculties here at the University of Alberta, from researchers further afield. And they've been approaching the questions related to refugees and migration, the current crisis in Syria, from a number of perspectives. This event takes a slightly different turn, and we're focusing on the impact here in Canada, specifically Alberta and in Edmonton. And we've invited a range of people here today to talk about Canada and the refugee crisis. And so I would like to introduce to you the panelists that we have here today. First of all, Mr. Andre Corbould, Deputy Minister, Jobs, Skills, Training and Labour from the Alberta Government, and he takes the lead on Alberta's refugee file. Jennifer Fowler, Director of Multicultural Relations, Community Strategies and Development Branch at the City of Edmonton. Erick Ambtman, Executive Director of the Edmonton Mennonite Centre for Newcomers. Agnieszka Weinar, the Marie Curie Senior Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence and at Carleton University in Ottawa. Ibrahim Sin, Executive Director of the Intercultural Dialogue Institute, Edmonton. And Reza Hasmath, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Alberta. We will begin by giving each of our panelists an opportunity to give us to make a brief statement about the refugee crisis from the perspective of their own work or research. And so we'll have this 5-minute contribution from each of the panelists and an opportunity for responses. And we will begin with Andre Corbould.
I'm going to get right to the point. The key question is Canada shaping a new model for managing the refugee crisis? Put simply, I would say no, I don't think so. And I also think it's probably too early to tell given the short time we've been involved in it. As you know, Canada signed the Refugee Convention in 1969, but we've been welcoming and accepting refugees since loyalists and pacifists fled to Canada during the American Revolution. So we've been doing this for some time. We also helped escaped slaves and free African Americans flee to Canada in search of greater rights. Almost every war, almost every conflict in the world has resulted in refugees or immigrants coming to Canada. That's kind of how we were made as a country. And over the years, there's been some good and bad responses to refugee crisis. I believe this current response with the Syrian refugee crisis is an example of a good response. In terms of a new model, shift in the model will often take place with a change of governments. We've recently had a change of federal governments. They certainly signaled a shift towards enhanced humanitarian and compassionate immigration, which we're supportive of, certainly. But I don't think this signals a change in model. And so far, we haven't detected any major shifts in economic immigration, although that might be harder to tell in this current economic climate here in Alberta in particular. What needs to be done? I think we need to continue on our current track. Alberta is certainly supporting the arrival of up to 3,000 refugees by the end of February. We're well on our way to do that with approximately 1,200 here now. And we'll continue to do the right thing from that perspective, and so far it's going very well. I think we need to stop focusing on 25,000 refugees by the end of February. That is the start of the work, not the completion of the work. I would be very concerned if somebody were to consider mission accomplished at the end of February. It's the very start of it when everybody gets here, and I think everybody in the room understands that. So we need to focus on the long-term 4-year settlement of refugees so that they can contribute to Alberta and do what they want to do and have great lives here in Canada, and that's where the focus needs to shift. I want to talk quickly just about some of the responses we've seen across the country, some of the negative responses, the pepper spray in Vancouver, some of the anonymous commentary we see on social media, which I don't think represents Canadian values. And I don't know if anybody watches Rick Mercer, but he had an excellent rant on this last night in terms of social media anonymous responses, so I encourage you to look at it, and I think it applies in this case. I think what we need to do in these incidents is just make sure all the right people are providing the proper moral leadership as Canadians to represent Canadian values. We've got some great examples of this, and one I'd like to highlight is the Alberta Urban Municipality Association, who has for some years had a welcoming and inclusive communities campaign across the province, and they are mobilizing that campaign to help and assist with the refugee crisis now in Alberta. That to me is a great example of moral leadership and a great sort of support of Canadian values. And we're seeing all Alberta communities do that. And I think we kind of need to drown out those negative, especially the ones that are anonymous. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all the municipalities, the settlement agencies who are really doing the heroic work of helping settle these refugees right now. The community organizations, the post-secondaries, the schools and the education system, and organizations like the Alberta Chamber of Commerce who are working very hard to do what they can to support the refugees. The fact is, we're going to help settle 25,000 refugees in the country by the end of February. We're going to do up to 3,000 here in Alberta. This is generally not a huge stretch from what we've done in the past. Between 2010 and 2014, 122,000 refugees settled in Canada, and of those, 12,000 of them have already settled here in Alberta. So this is not the first time we're doing this. We've got about 1,225 Syrian refugees here now. It is an excellent makeup of men, women, 55% children, and 175 of those are already into our Alberta schools attending classes in this new year. So I think things are going quite well overall. Organized, we're coordinated, we have a great collaboration with everybody, and I think it's the right thing to do. So thank you very much.
I took it from a perspective of we can do better. From a model perspective, I was in a part of a national strategy committee in Toronto about 2 months ago dealing with the refugee crisis, and the common consensus was not to waste a good crisis from the perspective of how we can do better. Just to frame the context of in Edmonton in the municipality, I work for the Multicultural Relations section, which is a body embedded within administration to work with within Edmonton and with communities to create a more welcoming community. That is our mandate, is to work with ethnocultural communities to create a more inclusive city. In Edmonton in particular, there are not a lot of municipalities who have that kind of infrastructure embedded within them from an administrative perspective. So we have staff who are dedicated to both Aboriginal and multicultural portfolios, which I think is very unique to Edmonton, and we're also very lucky. We also have the opportunity from working from a more high-level policy perspective that not a lot of other municipalities have that value in doing. And so what we have found through this crisis is that from a municipal perspective, there needs to be a greater voice in that policy driving immigration perspective. And I look at the refugee crisis as a how we need to look at immigration differently and how we need to work from a policy perspective differently. Just to create a bit of context from a municipal perspective. And what I've found in this crisis is in all levels of government, we've all been lobbying. Well, that's provincial. Well, that's federal. Well, that's municipal. Well, that's settlement. And I think we need to integrate that differently. And it does come down to systems, and it does come down to funding models. And so from a municipal perspective, our mandate, which we typically say, looks at those systems served to citizens. So bylaw, police, community services, community facilities, that kind of system where municipalities say, well, you know, immigration isn't our bailiwick, and that's for the province to take care of, or that's for the feds. And our settlement agencies are, in a way, they are funded to do this work. They are expected to do this work. Are they funded properly? I would argue no. But that said, the municipality is left on a day-to-day basis having to deal with welcoming communities. And it's not about funding for me, it's about policy. And so where can municipalities fit better in building that policy? This has been an incredible experience from that perspective, in that I have to say municipalities have been more involved as a part of this crisis than they have typically been in the past. And so from a model perspective, I think we need to continue that, because at the end of the day, when a citizen comes to Edmonton, it's the mayor who's on speed dial. It's those that provide services. And if your water doesn't turn on, if your electricity, if the police don't come to your door, those are what matter to people when they become a part of this city. And so from a policy perspective, we need to keep municipalities in that loop. And generally speaking, I think we need to serve newcomers, refugees, economic migrants in a different way for that welcoming, inclusive piece. And it starts with policy.
I thought some of Andre's comments were really interesting, so I'm going to start by addressing that. I think we're shaping something new. We may not know what it is that we're shaping, but it's very, very different what's going on. The ministry you work for announced $1,000 would go towards special projects to help settle refugees, which is something that I don't think we would be talking about 10, 15, 20 years ago. The province of Alberta is also lobbying the federal government on the living allowance that is allocated to refugees, because very clearly you can't find housing in Alberta for a family of 5 for $760 a month, which is the allocation. And so these issues that were largely ignored suddenly have the public attention. And so people are demanding something different, and those who were in the know suddenly are being asked, what should we do differently? How would we settle refugees differently? One of the big issues we face is getting refugees into language classes. So our waiting list has over 400 people and 200 and some odd kids waiting for childcare. If they get childcare, the parents can learn English. This is a huge issue, and it's known by the federal government, and now there's an appetite to address that. So Syrians are helping us kind of look at and address some really big issues that have been festering, and I think that's going to lead to some kind of system change. When policymakers and the public are that keen for change, it's almost inevitable that you're going to do something different and better. Andre also said that he was going to share facts. Generally, I'm going to talk in generalities and what our experience has been. I'll be really clear if it's a fact or just our lived experience, because we, I think, in the not-for-profit sector are seeing things quite differently. One of the really unique things is where the public is at. It is incredible, the outpouring of support. I don't know if there's been an issue, and certainly there's never been a refugee or immigrant issue that's got this level of attention and positive response. Typically, we process 30 volunteers a month to work with newcomers, children and adults, various types of programs. We're now doing 300 a month. Catholic Social Services, which has a big capacity to process volunteers, is doing 1,000 a month, which is unheard of, and is people wanting to help settle people in our community, make this the welcoming community that we are. One of the big challenges I think that we're all faced with is we have this outpouring of support and generosity and desire to be involved in helping people call Edmonton home, and we just don't have the opportunities to give them. And that's one of the bigger concerns that I have. Even on the funding side, we set up an emergency fund, and we would try to maintain about $10,000 in that emergency fund. It's now at $150,000. And so to honor the desire to support the new arrivals is quite the challenge for us, both getting resources out and connecting people with the opportunities they want. So that's one of the challenges we certainly are seeing. One of the other ones is in leadership, and I think we don't yet have the champions who are taking up this opportunity. The crisis that Jennifer had mentioned, there's something to be leveraged there. There's something that can be done. When everybody is so keen to see things done better or improvements, we need strong leadership to take that up and say, okay, this is what we're going to do with it. It's being driven very much by the grassroots and community people saying, let's do something, but we need to give them something to do or something to get excited about, some kind of meaningful change or contribution. Again, like, the appetite is unbelievable. I don't know that we'll experience something like this or have an opportunity to do so much change and to reshape a system so dramatically, because there's a willingness to do that. Thank you.
I was supposed to basically tell you the views from the continent and how they differ from what you experience here in Canada. And maybe I will pitch my speech in 3 points, which is policies, territory, and the political reality on the ground. So the policies first. I feel, and now I know after 1 year in this country, that Canada is absolutely incomparable to anything we know in Europe as regards immigration policy. The culture of welcome is so huge that I'm not sure that even in Sweden they had that until very, very recently. You know, that that culture of welcoming refugees, well, has been limited now in Sweden because the country put the cap on how many they can take, right? This is a different premise, right? So in Canada, you can basically discuss in the pragmatic way whom you want, how many, and who will come, what will you do with them. In Europe, on the EU level, the policies for the last 20 years were how to make people not come, and we don't want to think about anything else. So the policy on the EU level was put in place, and this is asylum policy and the border policy, and it was shaped in a way that basically the countries on the border would protect the core in the north and the west of the Union from the migrants. But this worked because the numbers of people who wanted to come were small. You would have maybe up to 100,000 a year coming through the Mediterranean. Last year actually changed everything, and now I come to the realities on the ground. As you probably know, during the summer months, Greece would experience up to 5,000 landings a day. Now it's down to under 2,000. And all these people, I mean, there is not enough place on an island like Lesbos. I don't know if anybody has ever been to an island in the Aegean. It's pretty small. That was actually the beginning of the huge exodus that was supported in a way by the states on the borders that were left alone and couldn't really cope. Imagine you had 20 case handlers on Lesbos. There is no way that they could process all these people. Now we have over 1 million asylum seekers in Europe, and we all know that that was partly perpetuated by the Willkommenskultur of Berlin. That was a beautiful thing to do, but the consequences are pretty harsh now. These are the realities. I heard from you that the municipalities might be a little bit, concerned how to deal with that. There are people who actually want to volunteer. Also in Europe, this is not the governments that do all this job. These are actually ordinary people who work every day until now to help refugees. So there has been also a massive engagement of the NGOs and the nationals. The end is my final remark is the consequence on the politics in the EU, the division between East and the West, that I can explore further. Thank you.
Since I'm from Turkey, I want to summarize last 5 years in Turkey, so maybe this can give some example, and it can lead further conversations, these examples. I want to start with how everything started. So when the war started, because Turkey and Syria, we share the religion, culture is very close. We are almost the same. So because Turkey sees Syria as like a brother and sister country, they opened the borders for everyone. So like no matter who you are more than welcome to come. So everyone entered, regardless they are like from Syria. There are Kurds, Arabs, Turkmens. So everyone entered into the country. When people come, based on my interview with the aid organization, which is the almost, I can say, second largest aid organization in Turkey. Isn't there anybody? That's the name of the organization. And I interviewed with the president of this organization about his views, what happened, and have you been to the location? And he shared one of his experience. He's been to at one of the camp in winter time, and he saw Syrians with their T-shirts, with their shirts. They don't have any, like a jacket, winter jackets. And he asked, how come you do not have any coat? You don't have any winter coats? They said, we were thinking this was going to be a week or so, and the war, we were not thinking this was going to continue as a war. And we just came, what we have on us, and just leave the country. And we were planning to go back. We didn't even unplug the refrigerators. They just left it like that. When you look at the population who moved from Syria to Turkey, there are different numbers. Based on United Nations High Commission, the number is 1.838 million people moved to Turkey. When you look at, like some other numbers say 2.2 million, but when you talk with the officials in Turkey, it's about 3 million people, because people start moving. When the borders open, people start moving inner country. And with our organization, we organize study tours to Turkey. At least 3 times I am in Turkey every year. And I've seen people, like on the streets, they have tents, they are living in tents, they have nothing. You can see kids begging for money, selling like small items, trying to make the living. Other thing is, this humongous move from Syria to Turkey creates so many other troubles. First trouble was helping everyone like fast was near impossible. Identifying who needs what for how long, it's near impossible. It took so much time for government officials and civic organizations to find out who needs what for how long. Another thing is, when so many people move, they find a place to live. Like, for example, this gentleman again told me they went to one of the 3-bedroom condo to find out what they need, and there were 37 people living in 3-bedroom condo. You can imagine how much frustrated is that to live in 3-bedroom condo for 37 people. They need everything. They don't have anything at all. They just like sit on the floor, sleep on the floor, and they need everything. And it was near impossible to cover all their costs. So what happened is, to cover their costs, they start working. So they were okay for any kind of work. They might be doctor, engineer, doesn't matter, but they were looking for any kind of work. So they start gaining 300, 400 lira. In Turkey, if you want to have a standard lifestyle, you have to make at least 1,000 Turkish lira. If you work under insurance is about another 500 lira. So what happened is, business owners wanted to use the opportunity to make these people work as a like $300, $400 payment. So to run that 3-bedroom condo, at least 4 or 5 people needed to work. It was really hard situation for Turkey to find out the resolution, how to handle it.
I guess I approach it slightly differently, because I look at the experiences of the migrant once they arrive in Canada, in the major cities of Canada, and what sort of experiences they have in the labor market. So are they able to acquire jobs? Are they able to get promoted quickly? What experiences do their children have? And what's really interesting is, I've done interviews the last 15 years with certain groups. I've looked at statistics and analyzed that. And what's really telling is that the first generation migrant who comes to Canada, particularly the visible ethnic minority who comes to Canada, what you find is that they earn 81 cents relative to the general population. So for every dollar the general population earns, they'll earn 81 cents for doing the exact same job, having the same qualifications, having the same sort of training and skills and experience. So that is a sort of a penalty that they face. If you look at their second generation, they earn 71 cents. There's actually a decline for the second generation using StatsCan data. And so this is telling, but what's really interesting, and so this entire conversation is about how to develop models. Before we get to that point of developing models, it might be worthwhile to understand why these penalties occur. And a lot of it has very little to do with, increasing their training or with, improving their language proficiency. A lot of it has to do with trust. There's a lack of meaningful trust that the general population has towards different visible ethnic groups. And what I mean by that, in terms of meaningfulness, is that you need to have minimum levels of trust to hire a particular individual. And so, there was a comment made about, the negative things that are listed on social media. Well, they might reflect a lot of implicit associations and negative attitudes that people innately have, but they may not express it, and so social media is a form to express that. The way I examine that is it's a form of a lack of trust because they don't have meaningful interactions. And so how do we, when we actually look at how to actually acquire a job for a migrant or a non-migrant, what you find is it requires social networks. So we see that first generation migrants who come here, the refugees, or even the high capital immigrant, high human capital immigrant, when they do come here, they don't have the same networks as the general population. 2/3 of all jobs are found through networks, and so that's a barrier there. Furthermore, when it comes to hiring, as I've suggested, this idea of trust, the employer must have minimal levels of trust to hire you. And there's a lot of implicit associations attached to that. And if the employer knows very little about that group, they're more likely not to hire you. So it seems like many people have said their backgrounds. I'm Trinidadian Canadian. And among Trinidadians, people see them as happy-go-lucky, friendly people. You think of Carnival, that's the first things that come to mind. And so you might want to be friends with them, hopefully, but you do not know whether or not they actually have the capacity to work in high-status, high-professional jobs. You may not have that trust that's implicit and it's required to actually hire them. So that plays a role, that idea of trust. So community's trust matters. And the images that we see of that community matters. So with the Syrian population, the way this is categorized is we see them as refugees. You might want to ask yourself, when you think of refugees, you tend to think that they're low-skilled, in dire conditions. And generally speaking, they might be coming from dire conditions. That's why they're being pushed in this context there. However, we don't meaningfully know about the Syrians. And we do not meaningfully know about their experiences and how we have more similarities and differences with them. That sort of trust that's required can actually influence their labor market experiences. And so that's the way I would approach this. For the second generation, in fact, the trust plays a role as well. The second generation, even though they are able to fit within the working culture, even though they understand Canadian norms and values because they've been socialized here, you find that they lack those networks to actually acquire that high-status, high-paying job. And in fact, because their parents accepted jobs in ethnic enclaves or lower-paid jobs than their education would denote that they should, you find the second generation are not willing to do that. And because they're not willing to accept lower-paying jobs or jobs that does not fit their skill set, you find there's a decline. So as I said, 81 cents for the first generation, and it's 71 cents for the second generation.
Now, many of the panelists have already made reference to each other's remarks. I'd like to invite you to go a little bit further on that. And before we move on to some questions, I'd invite the panelists to respond to any of the comments that you've heard so far.
Well, I'll just very quickly just sort of pile on that last point about this concept that we see refugees as refugees, and I think it's a really good point to make. And what we are trying to do with this activity now is just recognize and talk about the fact that the day they arrive here, they're Albertans. They're here in the province. They're Albertans, and from the day they arrive, we want to get them settled in their communities and get those cooperative, inclusive communities and start treating them like Albertans and not treating them like refugees. Certainly, they need supports, like a lot of vulnerable Albertans do as well. But they are Albertans, so I just want to make that point and re-emphasize it.
Yeah, and to Andre's point around language, and so what we're doing right in this regard is the Syrian refugees are coming in as permanent residents. As soon as they get here, they're a resident of Canada, which opens all kinds of doors for them to be able to integrate in a way a lot more quickly, to become a part of community, labor market, et cetera, in an ideological framework. So from a language perspective, they are residents. And even like within the city of Edmonton around how we're framing our language, we're, trying to push the fact that we're working with our Syrian residents, our Syrian citizens, and really moving away from the refugee context. I wanted to talk a bit as well from what Erick was speaking about from a citizen response perspective, in that this is really heightened, not a unique, because Edmontonians, like Albertans and everybody, has shown a real, they have big hearts anyways, but at the end of the day, we have really key grassroots community organizations forming for this support, but also ones that have been around for a long time. So we've got our amazing larger agencies like the Mennonite Center and Catholic Social Services, but there are many, many community groups operating in Edmonton that are doing amazing work, and we're doing it before, and have been able to also come to the plate as a part of this support. Ibrahim has, he hopefully will talk about what his organization does on the ground, but stuff like that, I think we really need to harness that energy in a better way. Looking at the leadership from those communities as well. We have several, Edmonton represents every country in the world. We have people from every country in the world here. And so the leadership within those community organizations as well has been key in the success of this.
So I think what's really interesting is understanding the limitations of what a government or an NGO or civil society actors can do here. Many of the issues when it comes to integration is actually quite long-term, it's generational. When we were talking about the European context versus, say, the Canadian context, one thing that we may want to be proud of is that we do have a multicultural sort of project in this country. And what the multicultural project does is not necessarily it fosters greater trust. It creates a situation where there's hyper trust between groups, because you get to actually know about them even at a superficial level. That's not actually occurring in Europe, in a lot of European countries. That's what it potentially accomplishes. However, there are limitations, and perhaps the members here may not want to say what the limitations are because it goes against their mandate. But as an academic, perhaps I can say that. And the idea here is it's not only assisting refugees through policies or assisting them through particular sorts of support networks, but they also have to take their own initiatives to develop these networks I'm talking about. They need to take initiatives to actually engage with the community itself. So it goes both ways here.
Because of the distance, we didn't really feel the tension at first. It's been 5 years since all the incidents started. And when Canada accepted refugees and welcomed them with the hymn, which is a unique hymn in Islam religion, it was very unique for everyone. Maybe it's really hard to understand, but in Muslim world, it was very unique. I got so many emails from Turkey, from friends, like, we are very proud of you living in Canada. You're living in such a great country. They are welcoming refugees, very welcoming way. This is one thing, like Canada did a great thing by welcoming them, but the need of the refugees, maybe Maslow's hierarchy of need. Based on that, people need soft requirements and hard requirements. It starts with physiological needs, safety, love of belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. So first, people need meal, house, place to live. They need job. But other thing is, by time goes, they will need like based on their religion, they will need places to practice their religion. They're going to need to practice their culture. They should learn language here when they are here. So we have to keep up the great work as in Canada to be able to be the model to whole world, because we started perfectly compared to all the other countries. I can say we started really well, and we can be the great model for this situation, I believe.
I'm so sorry, but I tend to disagree that you can be a model, because you are a model for a very specific situation. I don't think that you will see a million Americans marching to Canada at one point over 2 months, and you have to deal with it. So it's a very nice model, because this is a luxury of geography, I would say, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about is my sector. We tend to be known to be nimble. Civic government tends to be known to be nimble. We're really nimble when it's small activity. We tend to get a little overwhelmed when it's something as big as this, and that's where the provincial and federal government, they're actually much more effective at responding, because they have the capacity to do big things in response to big events. That's kind of the leadership group that I think really needs to be leaned upon, because they have the ability to lead the charge in a different way, which is another one of those changes that we're seeing. Traditionally, it would be large bodies looking to smaller groups to react because they're on the ground. Now it's almost a flipping because of the magnitude of the arrival of Syrian refugees.
We've collected already a large number of questions that have come in through our website, and I've compiled some of these. And so I'm going to start by posing a few of these questions to our panel. So the first question I have for you is, the media has often reported on the issue of the migration crisis without paying much attention to the distinction between refugee and economic migrant. This has often blurred the issue for the average audience. Why is the distinction between refugees and economic migrants so important?
I understand that in Canada, basically, as you explained, you get people who are permanent residents, so their papers are in order and they can be called refugees. In Europe, you have basically two categories before they become refugees. First of all, undocumented immigrants who come. And these people want to be undocumented because, for example, they don't want to be registered in Italy or Greece or Hungary, because that would not allow them to move forward. So they don't want to be officially asylum seekers, which is the next category. When you get this type of papers, then basically it means you're stuck, or you will be sent back, right? However, this is the only way to become a refugee. So we have a tension there, right? So everybody wants to be an asylum seeker in Germany or Sweden. Not even in France, this is interesting, or Belgium, not much interest to go there. In the media, basically, we have this problem, and that was noticed very well by people in Eastern Europe. The concept of refugee that people in Eastern European countries have is person that has nothing. Exactly what you explained, right? So we would expect a person who comes and has a shirt on their back. People who came to Europe were able to pay up to 2,000 euro per person to come. 2,000 euro is basically double average salary in Poland. This explains a little bit the tension of Eastern European populations who couldn't connect in their minds the two informations or maybe images. This is why the reporting on the economic migrants actually gained ground, and we still struggle with a distinction in Europe because the the motivations are very, very different and complex always, right?
There's some logical reasons why this occurs. Majority of migration are actually economic migrants to Canada, to Europe, globally. I would say upwards of 90 to 95% fit that category. We take in high-skill, high-status workers in Canada, in Europe, in countries like Poland, the UK, France. They do take that. Well, you have the Ukrainian population coming in there, so they're high-skilled workers. Irrespective, the fact is you have 90 to 95% of the population who will fit this billing. Why refugees is more visible and it's more attuned to the media and to the public's consciousness is because they're often coming from dramatic sorts of situations. They're coming from, war-ravaged civil wars, conditions in which they fit the billing of what we would say humanitarian class sort of refugees. And so because of those experiences, it gains greater notoriety. But we need to pay homage to the fact that the majority of our migration in Canada since 1965 onwards has actually been economic migrants. We've weeded for that in terms of weeding out for education, skills, and that's the type of migration that's the majority within our society.
Yeah, I guess I would say the importance of in the distinction from a government perspective is for us to understand what kind of supports we need to put in place. For economic immigrants, necessary supports are often related to integration, language, and employability factors. For refugees, they can often be much greater given what they may have experienced in the process from where they originated to when they get to Canada. And so based on that, we assume that there's going to be more financial, social, health, language, community supports required. But it's all focused on making sure both groups get the right tools to succeed in Canada. And we just need to understand the distinction from a government perspective so that we put in place those right tools in collaboration with the folks that we work with to do that. That's why it's important to government.
I was going to talk a little bit about the media. I've been really impressed with their response. I think they were really quick to recognize that the public had this huge appetite for information. And so interviews that would take 5-10 minutes were taking an hour and a half because they were so keen to learn about the process, both of refugees coming and settlement. Like they're quite knowledgeable. So what actually ends up being aired was quite different from the knowledge base that they developed over the duration of the last 2 or 3 months. And in fairness to them, they also knew what the public was wanting. They early on wanted information about process and refugees and who was coming. And then very quickly following Paris and San Bernardino and Donald Trump, very, very keen to hear about what good is going on in our communities and what are we doing to ensure that we're welcoming people who are arriving.
I guess for me, it's if I look at it from a citizen perspective, so somebody who doesn't think about the difference between an economic migrant and a refugee. But what I think we may be missing here is, yes, the economic migrant has the choice of coming to Edmonton and showing the skill set. What we don't know enough yet, especially in this situation, is that we do have people here coming with skills. We do have people coming as economic migrants, just not in that frame of context. And to understand better the situation they've come to that has given them the refugee status, but also understand the skill sets that they're bringing. And so for me, I think we need to better defining that when it comes to our new citizens and what they're bringing here, not necessarily what we're giving them. So I think we can do a better job in the media of framing that as well. To be fair, to have a better understanding of like when the agencies and the private sponsor groups are welcoming their families, to have a better idea of that before they come, so they can better help and assist with the labor market and all those other issues.
I just wanted to say, in Turkey, Turkish government called Syrian refugees as not refugee. They just called them as guests because of the brotherhood and sisterhood. But that just kind of prevent them from the responsibilities not to commit not to complete all the duties, I guess.
There's a particular reason why you would call them guests, because the assumption is they're not going to stay there permanently. So Germany's done this with the Turkish guest workers over how many, 2 generations now? They've been there permanently. The fact is that once a migrant does move to a country, often, particularly when they have children, they're not going to leave. So calling it as a guest is politically feasible, but practically it's not facing up with the realities of what's going to potentially occur. My basic comment was, when I mentioned that, was one addendum I want to suggest between an economic migrant and a refugee, often, and this is reinforced to some comments here, is that a refugee generally has is forced displacement. So there's psychological needs that they do have to face, and psychological accommodations that some of the services that's here, providing that sort of capacity to deal with the trauma of being forcibly migrated. And it's interesting. It's not only that parental generation that's facing that trauma. That trauma gets passed on to the children, and so we need to be able to recognize those needs. Again, the majority are economic migrants, and so that's a very different categorization. And so we need to distinguish that analytically.
Next question for the panel. German Chancellor Angela Merkel's open door policy towards Syrian refugees has been cited by many in the international community as an example of moral leadership. But she has also received criticism from opposition parties in Germany, as well as from members of the governing CDU and SPD coalition parties. In Canada, Justin Trudeau emphasized Canada's moral duty to and historical record of accepting refugees throughout his election campaign. But popular support for his relocation plan has since declined due to events in Paris and San Bernardino. In your view, does the EU or Canada have a moral obligation to provide leadership on the refugee crisis?
I believe so, because wealthy countries in the world, it's their duty to help those troubled areas, to build peace in the world. Wealthy countries in the world help those troubled areas, for those like third world countries. That kind of creates sympathy on those countries instead of hatred. So those people like on the first world countries living in wealth, they have everything they need, but here, look at us, here we have nothing. If there is a help, ongoing help to those countries, and if those wealthy countries open the door for them, give opportunity, I think it will lead peace in the world. That's why I think it is important.
The others, do we have a moral obligation to provide leadership on the refugee crisis?
If I put my academic hat on, approaching it as an IR theorist, I think states act of self-interest. And so is it a moral obligation? It's a great way to actually justify certain actions, but I think ultimately it's in our Canadians' interest to bring in certain amounts of refugees from Syria or where we have strategic interests in the region. It seems very realistic to say that and very crude. Another way to think about this is there any economic returns we get from bringing in refugees? And I think there are. We often wrap these conversations about migration within a social justice perspective, and rightfully so. However, there is strong economic returns we get by having these transnational linkages. By virtue of bringing in a population from Syria, we have a long-term sort of arm into the Syrian population and into that region in the long term. Furthermore, we prevent, at a small level, and in globally speaking, it's part of a small sort of contribution to prevent long-term radicalization that occurs. Remember, the majority of the Syrian population is actually going to Jordan. They've taken 1 million of the refugees in. They are at a capacity. Ideally, you would want the neighboring countries to handle this. And so if this becomes a long-term situation where we have refugees displaced for so long, it can increase radicalization. And so it is in our strategic interest to ensure that we do something about this rather than a moral sort of question per se, and solely.
Maybe to add to that too, and this is maybe, I think from the perspective of the government that came in now, it was about reinventing the Canadian brand in that way, from a strategic perspective, which I completely agree with, was needed. That said, from people doing work on the ground, like morally, we do this, Andre alluded this, like Edmonton, Alberta, Canada welcomes refugees. We do, this is what we do. This is a unique situation because of the numbers and because of the timing, but it is a part of the Canadian fabric. And so I think as a part of our society, we do feel morally obligated.
Yeah, I think we're all in heated agreement. I think we absolutely have a moral obligation to welcome refugees internationally, and I think countries around the world look to Canada for indications of what they're going to do. And I think the worst possible thing we could do is not carry out that moral obligation, because that would give others the excuse to say, look, even Canada's not doing it, and so maybe we don't have to. I think we absolutely have a moral obligation. I think it's who we are as a nation, and what we've done, and I used to be in the military, and I did 10 tours overseas to various different countries, and I can tell you every one of them was about a moral obligation for Canada to be a great nation and do what we do. So,
why do we have a moral obligation for one population and another population? And so why do we bring in Syrian refugees and refugees from other states? And so that's where the practicalities come into play, where morality goes beyond the moral question.
I would just say that, notwithstanding the focus on Syrian refugees because of that, the huge issue that's over there, we haven't stopped all the other refugee support and immigrant migration. So this is just focus because of it's a bigger problem than the others, but I don't think we stopped any of the other migration. So, and I don't think we should.
I wanted a little bit to talk to what you are saying. Moral obligation, it depends how we actually define it. Europe is, of course, the land where a refugee policy was invented, right? That was basically what this is a core value of what being European is. However, at this moment in time, basically this moral obligation is being put into question for two reasons, maybe three. There is a thing that we call absorption capacity, with the view that the wars and conflicts in the region will not stop. What do you do with this, right? If it was only about Syrians, this is not really a big issue. I mean, it is a big issue because maybe EU will stop to exist, right? But we have also other conflicts in place. The moral obligation that was put on paper, at least in the EU, is to take in Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, and Eritreans, right? That was the categories that we thought really need us now. However, we can also define moral obligation in another way, and this is very popular in the European left. Moral obligation of a country that maybe had a hand in perpetuating the conflict, and now everybody is looking at the US, you know, like. Right? Like, okay. I mean, Europeans, apart from a few Eastern Europeans, this is also very interesting, didn't want to go to war. We have to look at this issue from also IR perspective, right? I will stop here, but I think that also what is important, and I'm not sure that everybody knows it here, that in many European countries, actually the politicians now are asking for the revision of the convention, right? So this is where we are.
Well, first, the idea that the events of Paris and San Bernardino will cause a decline in the popular support for the relocation plan, I think is quite false. I think is the opposite. It roused this ugly, hateful minority to get loud because they felt they had a platform, but that in turn caused this very quiet, large majority to find their voice and say that's not how we as Canadians are going to define ourselves. I think it provoked that out of us. That quiet, silent audience suddenly felt the need to say and do something. And as for the moral obligation, I think it's such a difficult thing to say, to look at this as an obligation, because when does that obligation stop? At 25 or 50 or 100,000 or military intervention? We're recapturing that sense of what it is to be a Canadian and a leader on a national front or an international front.
The next question I have for you. Much has been discussed about the short and long-term logistics and the security challenges of accepting refugees, both in Canada and the EU and Turkey, not to mention the deeper cultural accommodation questions which have surfaced. At their extreme, the recent events in Cologne and Vancouver have shown us just some of the potentially difficult situations we may be addressing in the future. In your view, what are some of the biggest short-term and long-term challenges for the integration efforts?
Erick addressed a little bit actually about when he just spoke around the that loud minority voice in regards to like incidents in Vancouver and in Calgary as well. The logistical piece are the pieces that lead and support people to become a part of community. Housing being a very key piece. Erick mentioned the amount that our refugees receive when they come to Canada, so it's important to ensure that their housing is secure, their kids are in school, their health care is taken care of, so they're able to focus on the long-term piece of employment and just becoming a part of community. So those are really the short-term stressors. Catholic Social Services is one of the organizations that does some of that initial finding housing, et cetera, and then the long-term pieces of training, education, language, the Mennonite Center, and those kinds of organizations. According to them, as of Tuesday, we're doing okay in Edmonton from a housing perspective in getting our larger families into housing. But that said, when the subsidies end in a year, where are we going to be? And that's the question I think is really the key piece, is where, when our government subsidies end and the private sponsorship subsidies end, these people need to be able to stay in the homes that they've created for themselves. From the perspective of the municipality, it is, where are we going to be a year from now? And we need to start really thinking about that and planning for it.
I think I slightly mentioned about soft requirements and hard requirements. Hard requirements are the short-term ones, like meal, place to stay, job, and soft requirements are the really religious need, culture, and language. I want to give an example. Last night, I was sitting with my wife, and we are usually busy with kids at home. Last night, they slept early, and it was silent for a moment, and we realized it's been almost like 7-8 days we didn't have any guests at home. So we kind of get bored all of a sudden. So we said, like, we should invite someone. There has to be some movement at home. This is the nature and the culture of the Middle East. So these refugees who come to Turkey, who come to other countries, who come to Canada, like in the long term, they're going to need social environment. So they might say, okay, I am safe, but I'm not connected. What are we going to do with that? So we have to work with multicultural organizations who knows the culture and who can help them integrate it to the society. I think it is very important because in about a year or so, we are going to be facing other troubles. If we do not provide that, then mom and dad will not know how to deal with the kid. Kid will try to find a way to get connected. Language is a barrier, culture is a barrier. Then what can I do? This happened in Turkey. They start creating gang groups. In Istanbul courthouse, I have a friend actually there. Based on his what he told me, 2 people out of 3 people who comes to the courthouse are Syrian refugees. They might start committing crimes if we do not act fast about this. So we have to cover these kind of needs as well for them.
In terms of the short-term needs, I think they're really the practical ones, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the houses, the food, the language, the schools, health care, and that is all the things that we're focused on in the first days and weeks of their arrival here. I think the long-term are the more cultural and complex pieces. The jobs, the lifestyle, the community, the training of skills, and the secondary migration, because there will be a secondary migration internally in the province and in the country as people get settled and figure out what they want to do. And that long piece, what's really going to be required is the collaboration of all Canadians to bring that together. And the short-term piece can be done by settlement experts, municipalities, all the people that are involved now. What we need to really engage is every Canadian in the longer-term piece, because it's 2 sides and everybody needs to work together. I just want to comment very quickly on the security side to say that from our perspective, this is just simply not an issue with the Syrian refugees. We understand, and it is a federal responsibility for security, but we're very absolute confidence in the system that they're using to select refugees and bring them over here. So we have absolutely no concerns from a security side.
Maybe I will talk a little bit about the migration studies view on that. What the government and the population can do is one thing. The other thing that is very important in the success of integration are the expectations of people. But regularly in migration research, we see that migrants have very high, very often unrealistic expectations what will happen when they get where they want to be. So then the clash with the reality is so harsh that it can actually backfire, right? It can be on many levels, right? There will be people who will be unhappy with the society. I can give you an example. We took, I think, 100 Syrian refugees who are Christian in Poland, because of course in that country you cannot get Muslims. You can, well, for the moment. Anyways, they are unhappy there because the money that they get is lower than what they would get maybe in Sweden, right? So they don't want to stay. And after 1 year, you have a group of people that is very, very frustrated. What happens in Germany, for example, right? I mean, I'm a total fan of that country. If that country cannot do it, no one will. The scale is such that still people do not know what will happen to them. So they are waiting for 8 months, a year for their hearing. So they don't know if they will stay there. So this prolonged periods of, life that is not a real life can lead to radicalization, and this is what we are all afraid of in Europe.
I guess to answer this question is how we define long-term. I think if I was to define, I'm looking at generations. So I might have a different story than perhaps a policy perspective here. So if you define it within those terms, if you want to generate greater integration, you need to have that requisite trust I was talking about. So policy should be designed to generate trust between both groups, between the general population and the migrant group coming in. And I don't think we should discount and say it's a minority sort of group who is lashing out against migrants coming in, or, as I said, through social media, that they are disgruntled on that. When we look at our actual own diversity surveys, we see that there are often questions about, do you actually trust someone of a different ethnic background, or do you actually trust someone of a different visible ethnic background? The numbers are quite low. They range between 35 to 40% in Canada. In world terms, that's pretty high, actually. So we're doing pretty well in world terms. But that's pretty shocking when you think 35 to 40% of people actually trust a member of a different visible ethnic group. And so the idea here is, in the long term, we need to develop greater meaningful sort of contacts between the groups. It's not only doing, and again, in Canadian terms, in global terms, we're doing a great job, but we can always do better within our own society. And I think what that requires is actually encouraging meaningful interactions between different groups. And it's not only learning about their festivals or learning about their foods and culture and so forth. It's about actually engaging in a conversation with a member of a different ethnic group. In our context here, it's actually having a conversation with a Syrian. You find that most people, when we're talking about this, they don't actually know much about their lifestyle, and vice versa. And so it's that sort of mutual accommodation and generating that trust in the long term. In the short term, of course, we need to have policies that improve their linguistical skills, their training, having credentialism that's, meaningfully allows them to accredit what their skills are into Canada. It's about creating those networks, using ethnic communities, creating chambers of commerce to actually link together, and that's how you create the integration in a hyper way in the short term.
I really, really like how you're speaking in the generational, and I use this often, and it's in the work we do, like, you have to stay sane on a day-to-day basis. And so I frame it for my staff, and 20 years ago, in the Catholic school system, we wouldn't have been talking about LGBTQ policy 20 years ago. Now look at where we are now. I mean, it's complex. But that said, that's how I frame it, and so this is generational. And, my daughter telling me the other day that, her marriage to a man or a woman will be a fun day, mommy. I'm like, okay. So these are conversations that weren't happening 20 years ago in these kinds of contexts. And so we need to, I think, definitely look at it from a generational perspective.
I have a question, actually, to the panel. Because in Europe, we have a big issue with getting the people who are processed to the labor market, because they usually come without any documents that would say about their skills. Mm-hmm. The documents that would place them on some level on the labor market. How is it solved here?
It's interesting because I think if you look at the language of the European Union and Brussels in particular, again, it's just they're not distinguishing between the economic migrant and the refugee. The majority of migrants into Europe are actually economic migrants. I was an economic migrant to Europe. I went to the UK. I was a prof there for a while. And so the majority is actually economic migrants. And so how to process undocumented workers, yes, it has the media attention, but there's a small percentage of the population, of the migrant population that fits this billing. But one last aspect. Can I just finish there? One last aspect. We need to look at visible migrants versus non-visible migrants. So if you're a visible minority going into Europe, you have a very different experience than being a non-visible migrant in Europe. I can say it in more crude ways, but for being politically correct, I won't. But the fact here is there's different experiences that these groups face in both the continent and in the UK.
But Agnieszka, you've...
Absolutely different, not about that, because we have 800,000 people who are now in Germany. They will be processed. Half of them are already known that they have no documents and they cannot be placed on the labor market. So that was my question. Right. That was a positive question, okay? How to help them.
Okay.
I was wondering if maybe someone from government or NGO might address this. And so we have these refugees. They've come from Canada. Canada has processed them from refugee camps abroad and brought them. And so presumably there are many who simply, they've not brought the copies of their diplomas with them. How do they go about integrating into the labor market and getting their skills accredited? Is this...
Yeah, so it's definitely a hard problem, but there's a lot we can do, and so even for immigrants, this is an issue. It's not just for refugees. It's that certification process, and so there is quite a lot of activity happening across the country now with federal and provincial governments to reduce the certification time and find better ways of certifying folks beyond the normal activity. Including sort of, helping them get secondary documents or helping them verify, the documents perhaps they don't have in some other way. And there's a real big push across the country now to try to reduce the time to do that. Ultimately, what you want to do for an economic immigrant is actually certify them in their skill before they even arrive. And given modern technology, there is really no reason why that can't be done. It just requires a change of systems and those things. So there's a lot of work being done on this, but it's a huge challenge, and I would say that work is just starting. It hasn't been going on for long. But the good news is the industry is supportive of it. The associations, the professional regulatory bodies themselves are supportive of it. I also want to just take a quick opportunity to acknowledge a lot of the great work that's being done in the reception centers and with the settlement agencies who do offer a lot of formal courses on these things. They offer, electrician courses for certified newly arrived electricians so they can understand the differences in Canada from wherever they came, those kinds of things. So I think it's a lot more of that kind of activity that needs to happen.
My understanding from information that's been shared is that from a processing perspective on the ground overseas is that those who are doing the interviews are doing the best they can to collect that information ahead of time. So to process them in that way, the questions that are being asked are skill set based as well. But in regards to like expediency and stuff like that, I'm not sure how much of that information is getting transferred, but I know that through the interview process, my understanding is those questions are being asked.
Okay, I have another question for the panel. And given the slowing Canadian economy and particularly the severe impacts in Alberta that we've experienced due to the oil price collapse and rising unemployment and the pressure on public finances that this leads to, what tensions, if any, do you see between a primarily moral approach and a socioeconomic, legal, political, and cultural realities that we face here in Alberta? Are these reconcilable?
Well, I'll start off by quickly saying I believe that the tensions are actually more perceived than real. There's not anything we're doing on the refugee file in Alberta that's taking away from anything we're doing on the economic file. They're just not competing resources or dollars. We have different departments, different organizations focused on these two things. So I think the tension is perceived, and I think the way we reduce that tension is by education and explanation of what's happening, and the fact that the government's working hard on the economic file. They're also working hard on the refugee file, but also eventually, sometimes in the future, at some point, these files are going to come together when in 5, 10, 15 years, those 175 kids, or the 600 kids we almost have here now, are going to be graduating from universities and going into the Alberta labor market and doing whatever they do, and probably being elected officials as well. So I think eventually they will come together in a positive way. But I really believe the practical resource tension is a perceived one, not a real one.
Echo that. I think it's perceived as well. I mean, maybe if this economic downturn lasts for a significantly longer period of time, those tensions might arise. But I would think, every economic report I've read has said that Alberta is facing a huge labor shortage, and we need more people. We need to integrate them well into the labor force. So it basically is going to reconcile itself as we pull out of the downturn.
We can coax this into more plain terms. There's an attendant fear that if a migrant does come into Canada, or particularly this cohort that's coming into Canada, that they might take the jobs that Canadians have. I think that's at the heart of a lot of the attendant fears. And this is not reinforced by labor market statistics. In fact, what you find is they're taking jobs that Canadians no longer want to do, but moreover, if they are going to take the jobs, they're going to be competing with existing migrants into Canada. So it's kind of an interesting sort of paradox that it's not necessarily the cohorts we think are going to be affected, it's actually the existing migrant population who are competing with the other migrants for low status, low paying jobs in particular.
On the ground, speaking though, to be clear, our capital regional housing, affordable housing list is 3,800 strong. We don't have affordable housing in Edmonton. And in regards to this particular instance, there is nobody's jumping the queue here. So if in a year's time, like I said, once there's no more housing subsidies and our labor market, and we haven't had the opportunity to show or place refugees, newcomers, migrants into jobs where that's not going to be able to support their lifestyle. So there's no queue jumping. We have people who are waiting for affordable housing. And the key here is to make sure that they aren't joining the queue.
The refugee crisis in Europe happened right after we got Greece out of problem, for a while at least. This is actually important because the strain of the two crises in the row basically is now making EU to collapse almost. For example, at the country like Greece, right? A country on the brink of bankruptcy with very high unemployment, basically 1/3 of the population, and they were still able to welcome as much as they could these refugees, these people who came in these numbers. Of course, they didn't invite them too much to stay, but on the other hand, those people wouldn't stay where there is no job. And that was actually my question also to you here. I hear very often that basically immigrants in Canada, that they come to one province, but in the end they end up in Toronto anyways. So in the EU, basically what happened, everybody ended in Germany because Germans agreed that, in the end they would end up there anyways. At least at the beginning, that was the idea, because this is the only country with a strong economy and big shortages on the labor market. Now, of course, the issue is how to match these who come without the diploma in hand to this labor market, right? So this is a bigger issue, and of course, some of these young men who came believed that they could learn German in 3 months, but they see now that it's not the case. So there are some issues there, and so I was wondering how it works in Canada as well.
Actually, when you look at the stats, the most migrants go first to Toronto, then Vancouver, then Montreal. So it's not as though they're going to other jurisdictions and then moving to Toronto. Or it might be the case, but the majority are still doing that. And you got to look at the underlying reasons why. There's chain migration. If you have again, it's a Trinidadian population in Toronto, they're going to go to Toronto. It makes sense. They have families there. They have people they know who they can trust. And so that's why they go there. They settle in that communities in which they know there's a community that can support them. And so that's why you see this sort of patterns in that respect. You may not see those patterns as prevalent in Europe right now, but maybe in a generation or two, when you start seeing there's ethnic enclaves, in particular in parts of these countries, you're going to find migration. If there's future migration, they're going to go to those parts. So I think that's why you're seeing these kinds of patterns in the Canadian context. And just talking, again, I know you've been mentioning the credentialism and so forth. You got to remember most migrants, if they do come in here, they're going to take as I said, that 81 cents to $1. They're going to take a penalty. They're going to take a massive penalty on what their education and skills are, and they're going to be skewed to more lower status, lower paying jobs. If they don't have the credentials, one can assume the odds are that they're going to have lower wages even, and they're going to have even lower status, lower paying jobs. So, I mean, it is an issue of actually looking at their credentials, but they're going to have to, and it goes to understanding their psychological needs and their expectations. The expectation should be, look, you're not going to get the same job as you're going to get in Canada. And for various reasons, and it's not because of your human capital per se, but it's because of the operations of getting a job requires social networks, requires trust, it requires other kind of characteristics that goes beyond formal human capital and and formal education.
We have a final question that's come in from the website contributions. Many op-eds, as well as online communities on social media, expressed overwhelming good intentions in Canada towards helping refugees. How can we transform the positive energy on social media into substantial and long-term assistance to refugees, both Syrians and others? Is Canada a model?
Honestly, that's what's keeping me up at night these days, is how to do that, because it's an opportunity and a window that isn't going to be open indefinitely. And so how do we leverage what's going on in the community and turn that into something sustainable and permanent? The best I've come up with so far is to start doing sort of legacy things and try to make them institutional. So there was a welcoming event where the First Nations group welcomed the newest arrivals, right? And kind of doing that at City Hall and making that potentially an ongoing annual or I don't know, quarterly event, things like that would, I think, need to happen. Maybe the Prime Minister is going to go to the airport and give out coats every time a plane arrives, right? And that becomes a part of our welcoming effort. So it's looking for those opportunities where we're doing something tangible and leveraging that into something permanent.
Just from a community-based perspective, in all of the Facebook groups that I'm now a part of, when it comes to welcoming refugees, like it is happening in a very organic way, in a very cool way, and that's very technical. But there's been, and especially if you look at from a private sponsorship perspective, the amount of citizens that have come together to private sponsor who wouldn't have thought about this a year ago, as well, and creating their own networks on social media for fundraising, for, like I said, for awareness, from an awareness perspective. There's a piece of research actually happening right now around how you can harness community involvement through social media. One of my staff is doing it. And it's really interesting to see how a community comes together around that, and not just, for the moles amongst some areas, but the fact that it's not just Facebook, it's not just Twitter, it's not just Instagram, it's the collective power of social media. But that said, the audience, there is a significant audience that isn't a part of that. And unfortunately, that's some of the audience too that needs a little more conversation around why this is important. So I think social media in itself is creating a model in its own, but I think it's those who aren't engaged in social media that we need to outreach more to.
Yeah, and I would just say quickly, this is my concern about the focus on end of February and 25,000. We can't focus on numbers and a date because it's the very start of the work. And I think we have to, go from welcoming events to celebrate the ongoing successes of arrival over the next 3 or 4 years. And we just got to be very deliberate about that to make sure we don't forget it and don't stop talking about it.
We seem to be obsessed with the idea of creating a model in Canada that can be exported globally. I mean, a lot of the work I've done is looking at global models, how different countries manage diversity, from the light culture in Germany to the fair go concept in Australia to the assimilationist sort of models. And irrespective of model, what the model needs to achieve at a meta level is to generate trust. I mean, I've said this so many times, but ultimately that's what it has to do. Multiculturalism was a point to actually introduce the minority into the mainstream. It was to actually create trust. And it was a way to do that. And so we had that model. And we look at it in the bicultural way. It was to create trust between the Anglo and the Francophone communities. And it reduces conflict when you generate that trust. So again, if you take that long-term perspective, what does social media, does it have the capacity to do so? Yes, it does have a capacity to generate communities' trust by bringing people together. And I think that is anything that can actually generate that requisite trust, that meaningful trust, that's what all models should strive for.
I think that I already commented that the Canadian model is a very luxurious one. So, but nevertheless, in Europe now we're looking, I think that finally we are looking at the ways to open legal ways for the refugees to come, a little bit like the Canadians are doing, because we don't have that, right? You cannot enter embassy or any office in Turkey and say you want to be relocated to Sweden, right? You have to, unfortunately, walk this road on your foot. So this is an idea that is being floated, and one of the solutions to the issues that we have now. So I only can hope that the Canadians will keep talking to the Europeans and telling them how this works in practice and that it really works and that they should be doing this.
I'm going to use this last few minutes to take in a few questions from the audience, if you have ones you'd like to pose quickly.
Hi, I have a question that something was mentioned in passing. And the question I have is, Canadian jobs that were created as a result of the refugees situation. Is there any sense of that? Is that being tabulated? Is that being looked at as well? Because when we talk of a give and take, I remember hearing in the news that overseas that a number of additional Canadian immigration officers were hired as a result of the refugee situation.
Well, yeah, I mean, we haven't created a bunch of jobs in Alberta based on refugee support in the government anyways. We've got staff to do what we need to do, so we haven't done a huge amount of job creation for that specific purpose. We've been able to handle that with the staff we have. I don't know about anybody else.
In regards to, there's been, and Erick can speak to, like our settlement agencies in particular have gotten a few staff to support, and just from a proposal perspective, but nothing that I think can meet the need from what we've seen. But from a job-based perspective, I don't know that there's been any huge influx in staff.
I think we have an answer to that question from the audience, in fact. And if you could introduce yourself as well.
Generally speaking, I think when you have a panel on a particular topic, you try to get all of the players. And it's kind of evident Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada is not at the table. And a lot of the specific questions would be questions we might be able to answer. I'm the Assistant Director for Integration Programs for that department for the Prairies and the Northern Territories. So we did send 500 Canadian-based employees overseas in order to deal with the processing. So we did not hire a lot of additional immigration officers, but we hired a lot of local staff and outsourced to the International Organization for Migration and the Red Cross to do the interviews overseas. Domestically, like here in Alberta, we spend $90 million a year on settlement services just in general. We've put additional millions of dollars for this particular population. So all of the refugee resettlement agencies across Canada have scaled up their staffing considerably in order to meet an increased flow in a compressed time period. And we are just in the process of amending all of the agreements that fund settlement services, and the settlement agencies are also scaling up in order to meet this demand. But it's important to recognize we bring 250,000 people to Canada every single year. We have a very well-established settlement and resettlement system. Alberta, contrary to the everyone goes to Toronto, 50% of those that received settlement services in Alberta last year arrived somewhere else in Canada and then came to Alberta because of the status of our economy. So Erick's organization doubled the number of language seats last year in order to try to meet that demand. So there is kind of a push me, pull you that happens, and there is employment that's happening across the country. But I think it's also really important statistically to recognize refugees are net contributors to the country in which they relocate, particularly in the Canadian context. Our biggest challenge, which is a good challenge to have, is to make sure that the Syrians that are arriving or any other population stays in language training long enough to get to a higher level of proficiency that will lead to better jobs and higher economic outcomes, because the driving force for these families is employment. Every person in that family that can earn an income is already looking for a job here in Edmonton, and what we're trying to do is make sure they can both get language training and they can work, because that is one of the primary motivations. And just two other things, if I might, recognizing we're on a university campus. Housing allowances. Fairness is absolutely key. These are not picked out of a vacuum. They match provincial welfare rates. I'm responsible for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba for refugee resettlement, and they're variable based on the local rates because we do not want to create a situation where Canadians are being disadvantaged or perceived to be disadvantaged in relationship to refugees. So it's pegged to something very specific. In Alberta, refugees are not accessing social housing because we have these long wait lists. They are accessing social housing in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan because they have a different kind of approach to how this thing works. On the facts, I've spent 20 years working on economic outcomes for newcomers and for social capital in particular, and I've never heard the statistics that you're using. I think that we should be more precise in what we're talking about. The second generation does very, very well. It outperforms the Canadian born in terms of educational outcome, and when you look at visible minority versus non-visible minority, there are some differences, but they're nothing like the scale that you're recognizing. And the social capital measures, absolutely, it's at least double that in most studies that I've looked at over the last 20 years. So one of the core pieces of business the three orders of government are looking at are language training, including for those that are not labor market destined, social capital, so things like the host program that match Canadian families with the newcomers to make sure they have those connections, and labor market attachment at the best possible level. So these are all things that are actively being worked away at, and if we want to talk specifics on the Syrian population, we would be prepared to do so at the reception.
To add to John's comment about the panel makeup as well, I want to speak to the private sector interest in this as well, and their desire to support what's happening here in Alberta. We've had a lot of outreach from private sector to the municipality on how they can support, and from a language perspective, implementing programs in their own businesses to support this as well. So we're seeing a lot of that too.
Okay, we've got one more question, and
this
then
is a quick question for Erick. What is the best way, because I've reached out to become involved in volunteering, and I've run up to wait times, and I can appreciate that the agencies I reached out to can't process me as a volunteer fast enough, but I'm eager to engage in the process. What's the best way that I could begin volunteering tomorrow?
It's a big concern when you've got all these people who are that keen to get involved and you just can't give them the opportunity. You know, I worry that people like yourself won't have that opportunity, and the next time you're moved to reach out and try to do something to support whatever group it might be, you'll be reluctant because you haven't had that positive experience. We're overwhelmed. I know Catholic Social Services is overwhelmed. Essentially all the agencies that do this sort of work, the scale and scope of people who are reaching out to us is more than we can handle. We're working with the province actually to try to create a couple of new positions just to help process and make connections, because there's lots to do. We just don't have the capacity to connect that generosity that people like you have with the need that exists, because it's just not been our tradition. And you know, I mentioned earlier, we're not nimble at these kind of big things and reacting in big ways to big events, and that's something that not-for-profits are now doing some soul searching to figure out how we can accommodate, like I said, that generosity. But it's a terrible answer, but you know, call and get on the waiting list. And for my agency, I would say, you know, for every 3 people that call, we're getting back to 2 of them with some kind of efficiency, and one's falling through the gaps, which is sad and embarrassing for me, but we just can't seem to respond to the community outpouring of support.
Just other suggestions as well. And so for obviously the immediate desire, but if you look even to your community-based organizations, your community leagues, other organizations within your community who you might say, okay, 6 weeks or 2 months down the road when it's not like front page news, how are we as a community going to work together to welcome these newcomers? And from my perspective, from a volunteer perspective, that's a way to get involved as well. Go to your community league, look at your grassroots organizations too, who have the ability to look at longer term support.
Okay, this might be provocative, but if you want to volunteer, I'm not sure that you know that on the Greek islands we have an army of volunteers. No, seriously, who come not only from Europe. We have also Americans. We have also the Canadians. We have also Australians. All these people working all the time, day and night, to make the life of the Syrians who arrive livable. I know that any pair of hands anywhere, especially in these places where you get this number of people, is welcome.
I also have a suggestion. In the future, hopefully we'll be working with Mennonite Center for organizing events and for Syrian refugees. So you can reach Mennonite Center through us, so you can volunteer for IDI Edmonton and help Mennonite Center as well for that purpose.
We'd like to continue this conversation in a more informal way at the reception. Please join me in giving a warm thank you to our panelists this evening.